Why Galactic Mercenaries Are Terrified of Facing Human Special Forces. Part 1. The Rumor That Spread Across the Stars. The station called Vithara Crossing was not the kind of place that appeared on any official star map. It sat at the edge of a dead trade route, held together by old metal and older deals, and it smelled like engine oil, cheap food, and secrets. Ships from a dozen different worlds docked there every cycle. Some came to trade, some came to hide. Most came to do both at the same time. Drax Vel had been coming to Vithara Crossing for 15 years. He was a mercenary captain of the Horathi clan, tall and broad-shouldered with rough gray skin and small black eyes that missed very little. He had fought on 11 different worlds. He had won most of those fights. But he had hired soldiers of almost every species the galaxy had to offer, and he had learned over a long career that fear was a tool, something you pointed at other people, not something that lived in your own chest. He was sitting in a cantina called the Broken Orbit, when the old Cathari trader sat down across from him, without being invited. The Cathari were a small species, four-fingered and pale, with wide flat faces and voices like dry leaves. This particular one was old enough that the skin around his eyes had gone almost white. He set a drink on the table, looked over both shoulders, and leaned forward. "I want to tell you something," the trader said, "and I want you to listen before you decide what to think about it." Drax Vel looked at him for a moment, then he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "A talk." 3 years ago, the trader said quietly, the Mercenary Guild of Varakis took a contract to hold a moon called Kelthera, 4 during the Syndicate Uprising. They sent 600 soldiers, good ones, mixed species, good equipment, proper training. They were supposed to hold the moon for 30 days until the Syndicate could move its supply lines into position. "I remember the uprising," Drax Vel said. "Then you remember that the moon never fell to any opposing army," the trader said. "What you may not know is why." He wrapped both hands around his drink. "The humans sent 14 soldiers to take it back." Drax Vel did not say anything right away. He was a man who had lived long enough to know that the first reaction to an unlikely number was usually the wrong one. So he waited. 14, the trader repeated. Not 1,400, not a 14-ship strike force, 14 individual human soldiers. They went in at night. By the time the sun came up on that moon, it was over. "You are telling me 14 soldiers defeated 600, Drax Vel said. "I am telling you 14 soldiers did not defeat them," the trader said. "Defeat means fighting. There was not much fighting. What those 14 soldiers did was move through 600 trained mercenaries like they were moving through empty rooms. When the Guild's recovery team arrived 2 days later, they found every single one of those 600 soldiers alive. None of them were badly hurt. They were sitting in a circle in the main courtyard, tied together with cable, completely disarmed, all their equipment stacked neatly nearby." He paused. The humans were already gone. The cantina noise went on around them. Someone on the other side of the room laughed loudly at something. The ventilation unit above the bar hummed its slow, mechanical hum. "The Syndicate pulled their contract from Varakis the next morning," the trader continued. "No explanation, no negotiation, just gone. And the 600 soldiers who had been on that moon, not one of them ever took another contract that involved humans. Not one. Some of them left the mercenary business entirely." 600 trained soldiers, Drax Vel said slowly, "and not one of them wanted to go back. Not one." The trader's voice was very flat. "I know one of the men who was on that moon. He has been my neighbor for 2 years. He is not a frightened person. He spent 30 years as a professional soldier before Kelthera 4, and since then, he does not talk about it much. But once, when he had too much to drink, he told me that the worst part was not being taken down. The worst part was not seeing them coming. Not at all, in any direction, at any point. 600 soldiers with sensors and lights and overlapping watch rotations, and those 14 humans moved through all of it as if it simply was not there. The traitor shook his head. He said it felt less like being defeated by soldiers and more like being handled by something that was very calm and very certain and very much in a different category than anything he had ever faced before. Drax Vel was quiet for a long moment after that. Outside the cantina's single porthole window, a cargo freighter was drifting slowly past, its running lights blinking in the dark. "What are they called?" he asked. "The Ghost Company," the trader said. "First Special Operations Unit of the Human Armed Forces. Most of what is on record about them is locked behind military clearance levels that most governments in this part of the galaxy cannot reach." He picked up his drink, then set it back down without taking a sip. "What is not locked is enough. Ask around. Talk to anyone who has been on the wrong side of a human military operation in the last 10 years. The story is always similar. Impossible conditions, impossible timeline, and the humans do it anyway, quietly, without drama, and then they go home." He stood up, picked up his drink, and nodded once at Drax Vel as if they had been discussing nothing more important than cargo prices. "I am telling you this," the trader said, "because you are a smart man who takes contracts for a living. And because the word going around is that the syndicate is hiring again. And because if any of those contracts put you on the same ground as Ghost Company, I would prefer to still have someone to drink with at this table next year." Then he walked away, disappearing into the noise of the cantina. Drax Vel sat alone for a long time. He turned the name over in his mind the way he turned a coin over when he was thinking, slowly, with his thumb, feeling the weight of it. Ghost Company. He had never been afraid of a name in his life. Names were just noise. What mattered was numbers, equipment, training, position. But the number 14 was still sitting in his head like a stone that would not move. 14 soldiers, 600 opponents. Not one casualty on either side, not one alarm raised. Not one trace left behind, except 600 disarmed soldiers sitting in a circle, waiting for someone to come untie them. He finally reached over and opened the small data terminal built into the cantina table. He typed in the name. Most of what came back was blank space where information had been removed. A few public records, a list of operations that had no details attached, just dates and coordinates and the word completed next to each one. Every single one said completed. He closed the terminal. He finished his drink. He sat in the noise and the dim light of the broken orbit and thought carefully about the next contract sitting in his inbox and whether he really needed the money as much as he thought he did. For the first time in a very long career, Drax Vel decided to be careful. Why galactic mercenaries are terrified of facing human special forces. Part 2. The Briefing. Nobody wanted to attend. The transport ship called the Ardent Cross was not a comfortable vessel. Its corridors were narrow, its bunks were hard, and the heating in the lower deck had not worked properly in 6 months. The crew had stopped filing repair requests about it because nobody ever answered them. They had simply started sleeping in their uniforms and calling it character building. Captain Lena Briggs did not mind the cold. She had grown up in northern Montana, where the winters came early and stayed long, and the wind off the mountains had an opinion about everything. A broken heater on a military transport ship was, by comparison, not worth thinking about. She was standing in the briefing room with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, looking at a holographic map of a gas giant called Veros, and listening to her team settle into their seats with the particular brand of tired energy that Ghost Company always brought to a briefing. Alert enough to catch everything, relaxed enough that a stranger might mistake it for indifference. There were 12 of them in the room. She knew every face the way she knew her own hands, completely, without having to think about it. Sergeant Vic Alvarez, who was field stripping a sidearm at the briefing table because sitting still without doing something was physically impossible for him. Corporal Dean Hartley, who was tilted back in his chair at an angle that should have tipped it over but somehow never did. Lieutenant Dale Owens, who was studying the holographic map with quiet focus, his eyes moving over it in the slow, careful way of someone who was already building a plan. Specialist Carrie Nolan, Corporal Pete Larson, and the rest, 12 people who between them had completed more combined operations than most military units twice their size. "All right," Lena said, setting her cold coffee down. "Here is what we have." She moved the map to show the full structure of Varos's upper atmosphere. 4 industrial platforms sitting above the cloud line, connected by transit tubes, anchored to each other by thick pressurized cables that groaned and flexed in the constant upper atmosphere wind. The platforms had been built originally for atmospheric research. Now they were being used for something else entirely. "Thus, the Syndicate is running an illegal fuel processing operation on Platform 7, she said, pointing at the largest of the 4 structures. "They have been using the cloud cover of Varos as concealment for 14 months. The Interstellar Trade Commission has been building a case against them, and they now have enough evidence to move. But they need the physical records from the platform's operations center to close it. That is what we are going in to get." She paused. "The Syndicate has hired security from the Vorakis Mercenary Guild. 200 personnel spread across all 4 platforms, with the heaviest concentration on Platform 7. 200, Dean said without changing his expression. 12 of us. "You are correct," Lena said. "Just checking," Dean said. Vic did not look up from the sidearm. What is the entry point?" "Storm access shafts," Lena said. "They run through the underside of each platform, maintenance channels for the atmospheric sensor arrays, approximately 90 centimeters wide. Vertical entry. Wind speeds in the outer shaft will be between 400 and 600 kilometers per hour depending on the platform." There was a short pause. "And the timeline?" Dale asked from the far end of the table. "The second atmospheric window, the only one that gives us safe approach cover, closes in 18 hours, Lena said. Another pause. Vic finally looked up. He looked at the map for a moment. Then he looked back at the sidearm and continued what he was doing. "So to confirm," Pete Larson said from the back of the room, "we are going to enter a gas giant platform through maintenance shafts barely wide enough to fit a person in near blackout conditions with wind speeds that could tear an unprepared person apart against 200 armed security personnel with 18 hours from right now." "That is a correct summary," Lena said. "Okay," Pete said. "Just wanted to make sure I had it." She let them sit with it for a moment, which was something she always did. Not because they needed time to accept it. They had accepted it the moment she said it, the way they always did, the way years of training had made it almost automatic to look at a hard thing and simply begin thinking about how to do it. And she gave them the moment because it was the right way to treat people who were about to walk willingly into something that most soldiers in the galaxy would have walked away from without a second thought. Then she moved on. "Dale, you take Alpha Team to Platform 3. Carrie, you and Dean take Beta Team to Platform 2. I take Gamma Team directly to 7. She clicked to the next image, a detailed interior schematic of Platform 7, showing the sensor grid, the guard rotation pattern, and the layout of the operations center 4 levels above the storm shaft entry point. Once inside, we disable communications first, then the sensor grid, then we move on the guards floor by floor. Nobody gets hurt who does not have to. We collect the records from the operations center, we secure the personnel, and we exit through the upper docking bay when the window opens." "What about the security chief?" Dale asked. Lena had been waiting for this question. "He filed a resignation notice from the Syndicate this morning," she said. "He boarded an outbound shuttle 6 hours ago. He left behind most of his belongings." The room was quiet for a moment. "He knew we were coming," Carrie said. "He knew we were coming," Lena confirmed. Dean tilted his chair forward and put his feet flat on the floor. "So he is already gone." The security chief is gone, and we are still going in against 200 people who apparently did not get the same information." "They got the information," Vic said, reassembling the sidearm with a series of clean, practiced clicks. "They just decided to stay anyway." "Their choice," Dale said, as without any particular judgment in his voice. "Their choice," Lena agreed. She looked around the room at 12 tired, capable, unhurried human beings who were about to do something that the rest of the galaxy considered either impossible or insane, and who were treating it more or less the way a skilled plumber treats a difficult pipe. Not as a crisis, but as a problem with a solution that simply needed to be found and applied. She thought, briefly, about all the years that had gone into building these 12 people. Not just the training, though the training was enormous. Years of it. Brutal and exact and unending. She thought about everything before the training. The generations of conflict and endurance and adaptation that had made humans the particular kind of difficult creature they were. And the way the species had spent thousands of years being shaped by hard ground and cold winters and every kind of enemy imaginable, until hardness was not something they performed, but something they simply were, down to the bone. The galaxy saw a soft species from an unremarkable planet. The galaxy did not see what had made them. "Get some sleep," Lena said, picking up her cold coffee. "We move in 6 hours." Nobody complained about the cold on the way out. Why Galactic Mercenaries Are Terrified of Facing Human Special Forces, Part 3, 18 Hours Over Veros. The approach to Veros looked peaceful from a distance. The gas giant rolled slowly in space, enormous and pale yellow, wrapped in thick bands of cloud that caught the light of the distant star and glowed softly at the edges. It looked like something painted. It looked like the kind of planet that appeared on the backgrounds of tourism posters for nearby systems. Beautiful and still and completely harmless. That impression lasted until the insertion shuttle dropped below the upper cloud layer, and then the world outside turned into a wall of noise and force and absolute darkness that hit like a physical thing. The wind inside the clouds of Veros moved at speeds that were not entirely compatible with the survival of most known vehicles. The insertion shuttle had been specially modified for exactly this kind of environment. Its hull reinforced, its stabilizers tuned for high atmosphere turbulence, its navigation system running off internal sensors rather than external ones because external sensors were largely useless in the cloud. So it bucked and shook and groaned in a way that would have been deeply alarming to anyone who had not spent significant time inside it. Ghost Company sat in their harnesses and waited. Lena was at the front of the bay, looking at the descent timer on her wrist display. Beside her, Vic had his eyes closed. Not sleeping, she knew, just cutting out unnecessary sensory input the way he always did before a drop. Behind them, the rest of Gamma Team sat in their own version of the same quiet focus. Nobody spoke. The shuttle screamed around them and nobody spoke. The timer hit 0. The bay door opened. The wind hit like a wall. And then they were in it. The storm access shaft on the underside of Platform 7 was a vertical metal tube barely wider than a person's shoulders, and it was currently exposed to a wind that was doing its best to peel the platform from its anchoring cables. Lena hit the shaft entry point at the end of her descent line, caught the magnetic grip on the shaft wall, and pulled herself upward in one clean movement. The sound outside was enormous, a deep, continuous roar that vibrated in the chest more than the ears. Inside the shaft, it dropped to a pressured hum. She moved upward in the dark with her grip plates locking and releasing in a rhythm she had practiced so many times that it no longer required any conscious thought. Behind her came Vic, then Rosa Dunn, then Pete Larson. No lights, no communication until they were fully inside. Just movement, steady and quiet, upward through the dark. The shaft opened into a maintenance hub, 4 levels below the operations center. She came through the hatch at the top, rolled once, and pressed her back against the wall. She was inside. Two guards stood with their backs to her. Uvari, large, armored with pulse rifles held across their chests. They were watching a monitoring terminal on the far wall. The terminal was showing a rotating feed from the platform's exterior cameras, all of them pointed outward, watching for an approach that was never going to come from any direction they were watching. She did not reach for a weapon. What she did instead happened in the space of a few seconds and was, in its own way, a kind of art. She moved from the wall to the first guard with no sound and no wasted motion. And then the first guard was no longer a problem. And then she was already at the second. And then the second guard was not a problem either. So both of them were on the floor, breathing steadily, unhurt in any lasting way, their rifles disassembled in a neat arrangement beside the terminal, and their communication earpieces sitting in a small pile next to that. Vic came through the hatch, rose to a crouch, and looked at the two guards and then at Lena. He had been in ghost company for 7 years. He had seen her do things like this more times than he could count. He still found it slightly remarkable, in a quiet, professional way, and he showed that by not saying anything at all, which was the ghost company version of a standing ovation. "Dale," Lena said into her earpiece, her voice flat and low. "Moving," Dale Owens said, from wherever he was on Platform 3. He sounded exactly the same as he did in the briefing room. "Carrie?" Lena said. "Deep Beta Team is inside too," Carrie Nolan said. "We found a secondary arms cache behind the maintenance junction on sub-level 4. Dean is dealing with it." "Copy that," Lena said. She checked her timer, 11 minutes since the drop. "Move to communications on my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark." 3 platforms, 3 teams, 1 coordinated movement that had been planned down to the individual second. In the operations center of Platform 7, 4 levels above the maintenance hub, the Syndicate's head of security was a Cathari named Bros Akna. He had been doing this job for 20 years. He had served in 9 different engagements across 4 star systems, and he had never once had a bad outcome that he could not trace back to a specific, identifiable mistake, something that could be learned from and corrected. What was happening to his monitoring board right now did not fall into any category he had a name for. Contact indicators were going dark. Not all at once. That would have suggested a power failure, which was at least a known problem with a known response. They were going dark in sequence, floor by floor, platform by platform, as if something was moving through the structure in a pattern that his sensor grid was simply unable to track. He watched the indicators go out one after another and felt, for the first time in 20 years, a specific and unfamiliar sensation spreading from his chest into his fingers. He reached for the emergency alarm. The lights went off. The emergency power came on 11 seconds later, filling the room with a dim red glow. Bros Akna was no longer alone in the room. And the woman sitting on the edge of his command console was not large. She was not armored in any particularly impressive way. She was holding his sidearm, he did not know when she had taken it, loosely in one hand, and in the other hand she held a small data chip that she was turning slowly between her fingers. She was looking at him the way a person looks at a problem they have already solved and are simply waiting to confirm. "My name is Captain Briggs," she said. Her voice was calm and direct and not unkind. "That chip contains all of your operational records, cargo manifests, and communication logs for the past 14 months. You are now a material witness for the Interstellar Trade Commission." She tilted her head slightly. "Every one of your personnel on all 4 platforms has been secured. No one has been seriously hurt. I would like very much to keep it that way for the remainder of this operation." She looked at him steadily. "Are we going to have a problem?" Bros Akna looked at the empty holster on his hip. He looked at the data chip. He thought about the operations board behind him with every single indicator dark. He thought about the security chief who had packed nothing, boarded a shuttle, and left 6 hours ago. A man with 30 years of experience who had looked at a single piece of intelligence about who was coming and decided immediately that leaving was the only sensible option. He had thought at the time that the security chief was overreacting. "No," Brosakna said. "No problem." "Good," she said. She stood up from the console, pocketed the chip, and held out a container of water. "Is anyone in your team injured?" I want to make sure everyone has what they need before the Trade Commission transport arrives." He took the water without really knowing why. He stood in the red-lit operations center of a platform he had been hired to protect, surrounded by the evidence of a complete and silent failure, and he looked at this human woman who had just walked through 200 trained soldiers like they were furniture, and who was now asking if anyone needed water. He did not have a word for what she was. He was not sure the language had one. "No," he said again. "No one is hurt." "Good," she said again, and turned to speak quietly into her earpiece, already moving on to the next item on a list that he suspected was very long and very precise. By the time the Trade Commission transport docked 6 hours later, every platform was secure. Every piece of evidence was packaged and cataloged. Every one of the 200 Varakas security personnel was alive, uninjured, and sitting in an orderly group in the central transit junction with water and a clear explanation of what would happen next. Ghost Company was already gone. Why galactic mercenaries are terrified of facing human special forces. Part 4. The debrief at Vithara Crossing. The story reached Vithara Crossing before the official reports did, which was how things usually worked at a station like that. Official reports moved through proper channels, which were slow and full of people who rewrote things before they passed them along. Stories moved through people, which was much faster. And the people at Vithara Crossing were the kind of people who understood instinctively that accurate information was worth more than comfortable information. Within 3 days of the Veros operation, Draxvel had heard 4 separate versions of the story from 4 separate sources in 4 different parts of the station. The details shifted slightly from version to version, the way details always do when a story passes through enough mouths. But the center of the story stayed the same in every version: 12 humans, 4 platforms, 200 guards, and an operation that had been over before most of the guards understood it had started. He was on his 3rd day back at Vithara Crossing when he went to the broken orbit again and found, sitting 2 stools down at the bar, a young Varakas soldier with a guild badge still on his jacket and a support brace fitted around his right forearm. The brace was the kind given for soft tissue injuries. Painful, but not serious. The kind you got when something moved fast near you and you hit a wall. Draxvel sat down 1 stool away and ordered a drink. He did not say anything for a few minutes. The soldier stared at the bar top. "You were at Veros," Draxvel said finally. The soldier looked over at him. He did not seem surprised to be identified. He just nodded once, slowly, and looked back at his drink. "Tell me what it was like," Draxvel said. The soldier was quiet for long enough that Draxvel thought he might not answer at all. Then he picked up his drink, held it without drinking, and started talking. "We were good," the soldier said. "I want you to understand that. Our captain was not a fool. He had done this kind of work for 15 years. He set us up correctly. Overlapping watch rotations, full sensor coverage, motion detectors and thermal readers on every corridor, pressure pads on the floor at every access junction. There was no way into that platform without tripping at least 3 separate detection systems. He had drilled us on response protocols until we could move to any position on any floor in under 40 seconds. He paused. We were genuinely prepared. I am not telling you a story about a captain who was careless. We were ready. And, Draxvel said. And none of it worked, the soldier said. He said it simply, without bitterness, and in the flat voice of a person who had spent several days trying to understand something and had not yet arrived at any conclusion that satisfied him. The sensors started going dark about 40 minutes after the atmospheric window opened. Not all at once. That would have been a power issue, which we had a plan for. They went out in a pattern, floor by floor, station by station across all 4 platforms at the same time, but in a pattern inside each platform, moving inward and upward. He shook his head. The pattern made no sense to us. We could not figure out the direction of approach because there was no single direction. It was coming from below and inside simultaneously, which should not have been possible because the storm shafts are not passable. The wind speeds alone should have made them impossible. But they used the storm shafts, Draxvel said. They used the storm shafts, the soldier confirmed. We found the entry points afterward. Clean entry on every platform, magnetic grip marks on the inner shaft walls, perfectly spaced. No damage, no tool marks, nothing forced. They went up those shafts in the dark, in winds that would have thrown an unprepared person off the platform and into the cloud layer, and they moved through them like it was a calm corridor on a quiet day. He finally drank from his glass. I have thought about this a great deal since then. I keep coming back to the same thing. They were not lucky. There was nothing accidental about any of it. Every single decision, every single movement was exactly what it needed to be. Not approximately right. Exactly right. And they made all of those exact right decisions in the dark, in a structure they had never been inside, under conditions that should have made precision impossible. Draxvel turned his drink slowly on the bar top. And when they reached your people, the soldier set his glass down. That is the part I keep coming back to most, he said. I was on sub-level 2 when it happened to me. I was at my post watching the corridor and I turned around because I heard, I do not know what I heard. Something very small. And there was a human standing behind me. Not close enough to touch me, but close enough that I understood completely that touching me was not a problem for him at all, and that the only reason he had not was because he did not want to. He looked at his braced forearm. I went for my weapon. It was the automatic reaction. You train for months, and the reaction becomes automatic. He moved, I hit the wall, and then I was on the floor, and he was already gone down the corridor. The whole thing lasted maybe 2 seconds. My weapon was on the floor next to me, unloaded. I had not felt him take it apart. The bar around them continued its noise. Nobody nearby was paying attention to them. The conversations and clinks and background sounds of the station went on as they always did, indifferent to the particular weight of this particular conversation. The one that came to check on us afterward, the soldier said after a moment. After it was over and we were all sitting in the transit junction, she was the captain, I think, small, dark-haired, quiet. She walked through our group and asked each team if anyone was hurt. See, she had water. She handed it out personally. She stopped at every person who looked like they might be in pain and made sure they were all right before she moved on. He looked at Draxvel directly for the first time in the conversation. I have been in 8 engagements across my career. I have never had an opposing force check on my well-being after securing me. Not once. Usually the goal is to be efficient and then leave before anyone can cause problems. She was being efficient and also making sure that 200 people she had just taken down were comfortable. He paused. It was the strangest thing I had ever seen, and somehow it was more unsettling than all the rest of it combined. Why? Draxvel asked, though he thought he already knew. Because it told me something about what they were, the soldier said. Or everything else. The shafts, the sensors, the darkness, all of it. That told me they were skilled beyond anything I had encountered. But the water told me something different. It told me they were not trying hard. It told me that what had just happened to 200 trained soldiers was not the limit of what they could do. It was well within their comfort. They were calm because this was not a stretch for them. They were careful with us because they had enough control over the situation that being careful cost them nothing. He shook his head slowly. You understand what I mean. The scariest part was not how good they were. The scariest part was how easy it seemed. Draxvel understood exactly what he meant. The soldier finished his drink and set the glass on the bar. He looked tired in a way that was not about sleep. My captain filed a notice with the guild that morning, the soldier said. He will not accept any contract that involves proximity to human forces. Any humans, not just military, not just special operations, just humans in general. He does not want to be anywhere near the situation. He stood up from the stool, carefully, favoring his braced arm. I think he is right. I used to think that was the kind of decision a frightened person makes. Now I think it is the kind of decision a wise person makes. He reached for his jacket. There is no shame in knowing the difference between a difficult opponent and something that is simply in a different category than yourself. He walked away through the crowd and was gone. Draxvel sat at the bar for a long time after that. He thought about the word the soldier had used. Category, not better. Not stronger, not more skilled, though they were clearly all of those things. A different category. As if the thing that made Ghost Company what it was went deeper than any single measurable quality and sat instead in something more fundamental, something in the nature of what they were, built up over a very long time in ways that the rest of the galaxy was only beginning to understand. He thought about the contracts in his inbox. He thought about which ones he was going to accept and which ones he was going to turn down. He made his decisions before he finished his drink. He turned down 2 of the 3. He was not afraid. He simply understood now, with a clarity that the old Cathari trader had first given him, and that this young soldier had now finished building, that some things in the galaxy were worth going around rather than through. Ghost Company was one of those things. He paid for his drink and left. Why galactic mercenaries are terrified of facing human special forces. Part 5. A Message to the Guild. The Varakas Mercenary Guild's annual threat assessment was not a document that was ever meant to be read by anyone outside a small group of senior commanders and contract officers. It was a working document. Practical, unsentimental, built for people who made decisions based on information rather than comfort. Every year it was compiled, distributed through secure channels, and then quietly filed away before the next one replaced it. The edition published that year was, by most measures, a standard document. It covered new weapons technology coming out of the Neth Collective, the shifting political situation in the Outer Syndicate territories, several updated assessments of rival mercenary organizations, and a long technical section on counter-surveillance measures that most contract officers would read once and then use as a sleep aid. It also contained, at the very back, something that no previous edition had ever included. It was a single page. It had no official header, no author name, no reference number. Someone had simply written it, and someone else had decided to include it, and the decision had apparently been made quickly enough that none of the usual editorial layers had gotten around to removing it before the document went out. Within 2 weeks, copies of that page were moving through back channels across the Guild network. Within a month, translated versions had appeared in at least 14 languages and had been quietly pinned to notice boards and corridor walls in mercenary garrisons from the inner systems to the outer rim. People were passing it hand to hand, physically, on printed sheets, the way important information sometimes traveled when people did not entirely trust digital channels. It read as follows. A note on human special operations forces. This is for the attention of all Guild personnel who accept contracts in regions where human military units operate. This note does not appear in the official index of this document. Read it anyway. In the past 4 standard years, Guild-contracted units have engaged human special operations personnel on 6 separate occasions, across 3 star systems and a range of operational contexts. The outcomes across all 6 engagements were, without variation, the same. Complete failure of Guild forces to achieve or maintain their objective, with no permanent casualties on either side. This page is not written to assign blame for those outcomes. The personnel involved were experienced. They were properly equipped. They were given reasonable intelligence and adequate preparation time. The failures were not the result of poor planning or poor execution. They were the result of something that standard planning and execution is not designed to address. The following is a summary of what has been observed, written as plainly as possible. On physical capacity, human special operations personnel have operated continuously for periods exceeding 3 standard days without measurable reduction in their performance. And they have been documented functioning in environmental conditions, temperature extremes, atmospheric pressures, high wind environments, low oxygen spaces, that would render most species combat ineffective within a fraction of that time. In several observed cases, they entered through routes and access points that were classified as physically impassable and moved through them without apparent difficulty. When asked afterward in post-engagement interviews how they managed this, the most common response from captured human personnel was a variation of the phrase, "We trained for it." On tactical adjustment, in each of the 6 engagements, Guild forces employed tactics that had proven effective against other opponents in previous operations. None of those tactics remained effective against the same human unit for more than one encounter. And in several cases, tactics were adjusted mid-operation, in real time, by individual operators working without communication to the rest of their unit. And the adjustments were correct. Human special operations personnel do not appear to require time or discussion to revise their approach when a situation changes. They appear to do it automatically, the way other species breathe. On psychological stability, in post-engagement interviews with Guild personnel who had direct contact with human operators, the same word came up repeatedly across different species, different languages, and different operational contexts. That word was calm. Guild personnel described human operators as calm while moving through hostile environments, calm when outnumbered, calm when their original plan was disrupted, calm when things went wrong. They were not calm in the way that means unaware. They were calm in the way that means they had already decided that none of those things were going to stop them, and so the normal fear responses that most species experience in those situations simply did not arrive. One Guild member from the Varos engagement described it this way, and her description has been included here because it is accurate. It was not that they did not understand the danger. It was that they had made peace with the danger before they walked in. And once you have made peace with something, it cannot be used against you. On restraint. In all 6 engagements, human forces had clear capability to cause severe harm to Guild personnel and did not use it. They secured personnel with precision. They checked on the well-being of the people they had just incapacitated, and they provided water, medical attention where necessary, and calm explanations of what would happen next. In 2 cases, they waited with secured personnel until relief forces arrived, which was operationally unnecessary and suggests the decision was based on something other than operational need. This restraint should not be read as softness. It should be read as the opposite. The capacity for restraint in those conditions, while operating at that level of intensity over that length of time, is the product of extraordinary training and extraordinary discipline. A species that chooses not to be destructive when destruction would be easy is not weak. It is in control of itself in ways that most of us, in honesty, are not. The recommendation of this note is straightforward. Do not accept contracts that place Guild personnel in direct opposition to human special operations units. This recommendation is not based on a single bad outcome. It is based on 6 identical outcomes across 3 star systems, against 6 different Guild units under 6 different operational conditions. The pattern is not a coincidence. It is data. Humans have been in space for less than 100 standard years. In that time, they have been underestimated consistently and completely by almost every species they have encountered. The underestimation is understandable. They are small by most standards. Their lifespans are short. Their technology, while advancing quickly, is still catching up to species that have been traveling between stars for centuries. On paper, there is nothing about them that looks particularly dangerous. But paper does not show you what a species was before it reached the stars. Paper does not show you the thousands of years of conflict on a single difficult planet against opponents who were just as intelligent, just as adaptable, and just as determined. Paper does not show you what a species becomes when it survives that for long enough and keeps moving anyway. Paper does not show you ghost company. The people this note describes have spent their entire lives preparing for exactly the situations we have placed them in. They were prepared for those situations before we gave them to them. The planet they come from has been preparing people like them for a very long time. We are not the first opponents to discover this. History, both theirs and now ours, is full of entities that learned this lesson the same way we did. Consider this note a courtesy from those who learned it to those who have not yet had to. End. The document was never officially acknowledged by the Guild. No author was ever identified. Several senior officers, when asked about it privately, said only that the observations were accurate and that the recommendation was reasonable. In a bunk on the Ardent Cross, 3 star systems away, Lena Briggs was asleep. She was on her side, one arm folded under her head, her breathing slow and even. On the small shelf above the bunk, a cold cup of coffee sat next to a tactical brief for the next operation. Half read, marked in several places where she had stopped to make notes. Her earpiece sat in her closed hand. She slept with it there so she would feel it if it buzzed. The brief on the shelf was for an operation that was, by most conventional measures, considerably harder than the one they had just completed. Fewer personnel, more complex terrain, a tighter window and a longer list of objectives and an opposing force that was better equipped than the Voracis Guild unit had been. She had read half of it before she fell asleep. She would read the rest in the morning. Then she would brief her team, and they would ask their questions and make their jokes, and sit with it for the quiet moment she always gave them, and then they would get up and go do it. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. The galaxy, somewhere far away, was writing notes about them and pinning them to walls in 14 languages. Lena Briggs slept through all of it. Her hand closed around her earpiece, waiting for the morning.